Hi, and welcome to Creepy Crime Story, where the darkest truths aren't imagined, they're real. They called him loyal, hardworking, the kind of husband friends envied. Yet, in August 2014, Robert Lehman's life ended in the place he trusted most, his job. What looked like senseless violence would expose a betrayal so deep it shook even seasoned investigators. This wasn't just a killing, it was a plan. On the morning of August 17, 2014, Robert followed the same pattern he had for years. At 42, he was a maintenance worker at the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Rail Yard in Tehachapi, California. He was known for his dependability, the type of worker who rarely called in sick, who showed up early, and who kept the routine running smoothly for everyone else. Friends described him as upbeat, always willing to help, the kind of man who kept the mood light during long shifts. By late morning, that pattern was broken. A co-worker walked into a small utility office near the yard and found Robert collapsed. Within minutes, 911 dispatchers sent deputies racing toward the scene. Paramedics followed, but there was little they could do. Robert was pronounced dead at his workplace. The rail yard was sealed off. Deputies secured the area, photographing the room where Robert lay. They noted small anomalies, a few scattered papers, a chair pushed slightly off balance. But what stood out most was what wasn't there. No broken locks, no forced doors, no overturned desks. The setting was strangely quiet for a violent crime. First responders understood quickly. This wasn't an accident. Robert had been shot. The wounds told investigators it was no sudden scuffle. Whoever pulled the trigger acted fast, precise, and had a plan for leaving as little disturbance as possible. Sheriff's detectives began their initial sweep. Every entrance point was logged, every footprint near the doorway photographed. Tools in the shed were checked for prints, though nothing immediately useful stood out. Deputies canvassed the yard, speaking to Robert's colleagues. Some had been within earshot but reported no gunfire. Others said they noticed nothing unusual until the call for help. That gap, a killing in broad daylight with so few witnesses hearing anything, added weight to the suspicion this was a targeted act. Investigators moved quickly to notify Robert's family. His wife Sabrina was informed that her husband had died at work. At that stage, details were minimal. The sheriff's office communicated only that Robert had been found shot and that the investigation was active. The rail yard itself now shifted into a sterile crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the entrance. Officers logged their time in and out. Evidence markers documented every item near the victim's body before he was transported to the county morgue for autopsy. For co-workers, the scene was difficult to reconcile. Robert was one of their own. He had clocked in that morning expecting another routine day. Instead, his body was leaving under the custody of forensic examiners. Detectives began sketching their first theories. A robbery seemed unlikely. Nothing of value was missing. An intruder forcing entry could be ruled out. The door showed no tampering. That left two possibilities: a workplace conflict turned deadly, or something far more personal. Yet even those options had problems. Interviews with staff didn't reveal any heated arguments or grudges. Robert was well-liked, not the type to inspire violent retaliation. That absence of a clear motive made the killing more unsettling. The first official press release described the case as a homicide investigation. Local news reported a man had been shot at the BNSF rail yard in Tehachapi, though his name was initially withheld until next of kin were fully informed. Within hours, however, word spread. Friends and community members began posting tributes to Robert online, emphasizing how devoted he had been to his family and his church. Detectives knew that sympathy wouldn't solve the crime. They needed tangible leads. For now, the physical scene gave them only silence. 2 gunshot wounds, no defensive struggle, no broken locks, no obvious motive. The decision was made to move forward with the next procedural step: a full autopsy. Robert's body was transported under chain of custody protocols. Clothing was bagged, sealed, and labeled. Projectiles would be extracted by the medical examiner, logged and tested for ballistic matches. Every step was documented, not just for investigation, but for the courtroom battle that could follow. The opening day of the investigation left the sheriff's office with more questions than answers. Who had the access, the confidence, and the intent to walk into Robert's workplace and fire 2 controlled shots? Why was there no trace of forced entry, no theft, no noise that drew coworkers until it was too late? This first layer of evidence set the tone for what was coming. Tehachapi had not seen a workplace crime of this nature in recent memory. It wasn't just the loss of a husband and father. It was the chilling realization that someone had orchestrated his death where he felt most secure. The investigation moved quickly from the rail yard to the county morgue. Detectives knew that every unanswered question about what happened to Robert Lehman would now depend on the precision of forensic work. A crime scene can provide context, but the body itself is often the most accurate witness. At the Kern County Coroner's facility, chain of custody was the first priority. Robert's body arrived sealed in a transport bag, escorted by deputies who documented the handoff down to the minute. Every article of clothing was carefully logged and bagged separately. Even the simplest items, a work shirt, jeans, steel-toe boots, were treated as potential evidence. The purpose was not only to preserve fibers and gunshot residue, but also to ensure nothing could be challenged later in court as mishandled. The medical examiner began with external documentation. Photographs captured Robert's body from multiple angles before any invasive procedure. The visible injuries told a stark story. 2 distinct gunshot wounds, each with clear entry points, suggested a close-range and deliberate attack. There were no signs of hesitation shots, no superficial wounds that might indicate a struggle. The precision raised suspicion that the shooter knew exactly what they were doing. X-rays confirmed the trajectory of both rounds. One projectile had traveled cleanly through vital organs, the other lodged against bone. Both were recovered and placed in evidence containers labeled with time, date, and initials of the examiner. These bullets would later be matched against potential firearms, becoming one of the critical links between scene and suspect. Toxicology testing followed. Investigators wanted to rule out whether Robert had been under the influence of alcohol or sedatives at the time of his death. The results came back negative. There was no evidence that he was impaired, drugged, or otherwise unable to defend himself. That finding reinforced the theory that the attack had been sudden, swift, and carried out in a controlled way. The autopsy also confirmed the absence of defensive injuries, no bruising on the forearms, no cuts on the hands. Robert had not raised his arms to shield himself. This detail mattered. It meant the killer either caught him completely off guard, or he trusted the person who pulled the trigger enough not to see danger until it was too late. For detectives, that insight narrowed the field. Random violence almost always leaves signs of resistance. A targeted execution often does not. Clothing was examined under alternate light sources to check for trace evidence, fibers, hair, or transfer from the shooter. While nothing conclusive surfaced at that stage, swabs were stored for later DNA testing. The meticulous nature of this process reflected not just investigative thoroughness, but the understanding that trials hinge on whether jurors believe the evidence was handled beyond reproach. Parallel to the forensic work, detectives began reviewing the timeline of Robert's final hours. Witness statements established that he had been in normal spirits when he arrived at work. He had spoken to colleagues, gone about his duties, and showed no sign of distress. That ordinary routine made the sudden violence even more chilling. The autopsy report was delivered to investigators within days. Cause of death was listed as multiple gunshot wounds. The manner of death, homicide. With that confirmation, the case advanced from suspicion to legal certainty. What remained unclear was the who and the why. Detectives now faced a procedural fork. Without witnesses to the shooting, the focus had to turn to what could not lie: data, records, and communications. Before that, however, the morgue findings gave them one crucial insight. This was no chaotic act of rage. The evidence pointed to calculation. Someone wanted Robert eliminated in a way that minimized resistance, minimized noise, and left investigators with as little physical evidence as possible. For Robert's family, the sterile conclusions of the autopsy were a painful counterpoint to grief. While his wife and children prepared for his funeral, the sheriff's office prepared for a wider net of inquiry. Grief and justice were moving on parallel tracks. As the body was released to the family for burial, detectives shifted their base of operations. The next logical move was digital forensics, pulling call records, examining communication patterns, and tracing whether Robert had enemies who lived in his phone rather than at the rail yard. The case was no longer just about what was found on his body. It was about what could be traced through data. The transfer from morgue to the digital forensics unit was more than symbolic. Detectives had exhausted the physical body for answers. Now they turned to what Robert Lyman's phone, call records, and data could reveal. In modern homicide work, evidence rarely ends with bullets and autopsy findings. The patterns hidden in numbers, calls, texts, pings, often carry the clearest map of intent. Investigators began with the most immediate source, Robert's personal cell phone, collected at the scene. It was a standard model, not encrypted, and the contents were quickly mirrored by technicians. Call logs from the days leading up to August 17th showed nothing unusual, calls to family, friends, and routine contacts. But what caught analysts' attention wasn't what was present. It was what was missing. A set of gaps appeared where messages should have been. Text threads had been selectively deleted. That raised red flags. People rarely erase random messages. Erasures typically mean something to hide. Forensics examiners ran recovery protocols. Within hours, fragments of deleted text began to appear. Some were incomplete, but enough context surfaced to suggest there were ongoing conversations Robert had never mentioned to colleagues or family. The tone of certain exchanges seemed coded, using casual phrases that investigators couldn't yet interpret. Detectives filed those findings as preliminary, evidence of concealment, not yet proof of motive. Cell site records provided another layer. Investigators subpoenaed Robert's carrier data. Analysts reconstructed his movements based on tower hits in the days before his death. Nothing stood out: home, work, routine trips into town. But then, a pattern emerged from a second phone. That phone wasn't Robert's. It was a prepaid line registered under a false name, one that still connected repeatedly with towers near Robert's home and his workplace. Burner phones are common in narcotics cases, less so in domestic homicides. Their appearance in this investigation escalated concerns. Who in Robert's orbit needed a hidden channel of communication? And why did this second device often align with his schedule? The sheriff's office sought a wiretap authorization. Judges require probable cause for that step, but by combining the deleted messages, the unexplained prepaid device, and the fact of Robert's homicide, detectives secured approval. The tap didn't just capture future conversations. It validated the theory that someone close to the victim was using layered communication to mask their movements. Meanwhile, financial records were cross-checked. Credit card and bank activity showed nothing immediately suspicious. No large withdrawals, no sudden debt, no purchases of firearms or ammunition. That absence was itself telling. Many impulsive crimes involve a financial trigger. Here, nothing pointed in that direction. The absence of financial motive reinforced the hypothesis of a personal connection. In interviews, co-workers remembered Robert talking casually about his phone buzzing more often in recent weeks. One said he once joked about people texting too much, though he didn't specify who. That vague comment, in hindsight, added weight to the digital anomalies. Detectives also examined Robert's work-issued devices. Rail yard policy required employees to log activity through swipe cards and internal messaging. Those logs showed Robert had entered the yard normally on August 17th. No unauthorized entries were recorded. Surveillance cameras, however, offered limited assistance. The rail yard's video coverage was patchy, with certain angles obstructed. On the day of the crime, nothing clearly captured the shooter's entry or exit. That absence didn't erase suspicion, it sharpened it. Someone knew where the blind spots were. The data aligned too cleanly. Sometimes that was the problem. When cell records, entry logs, and video all left no immediate trace of intrusion, investigators had to consider a darker possibility that the killer wasn't an outsider at all. Detectives pressed further with digital subpoenas. They pulled subscriber information on the prepaid phone, checked activation locations, and traced top-up purchases. Each lead opened into a larger circle of analysis. The phone was activated in a city miles away from Tehachapi, yet it repeatedly connected to towers near Robert's home. That contradiction meant whoever owned it deliberately attempted to disguise their proximity, a tactic law enforcement had seen in organized crimes, but rarely in small-town homicides. The sheriff's team began sketching a communication map. Each number dialed by the burner phone was logged, compared against Robert's network, and cross-referenced with social connections. Slowly, threads began forming a picture. Not a complete one, but enough to suggest that Robert's homicide wasn't a random act. It was the result of coordination. At this stage, detectives refrained from drawing conclusions. They had fragments, deleted texts, burner phone patterns, surveillance gaps, each pointed toward planning. None yet named a shooter or a conspirator. Still, The digital trail was moving investigators away from the theory of workplace conflict and closer to the unsettling suspicion that Robert's own personal life contained the key. In towns like Tehachapi, murders aren't just crimes. They fracture trust in circles that once felt safe. When records suggest that someone close to the victim went to great lengths to erase their tracks, it doesn't just haunt the family. It reshapes the entire definition of safety in the community. The next step was inevitable. To understand why Robert Lyman had been targeted, detectives had to dig deeper into his relationships, not just his devices. Data had revealed coordination. Now it was time to explore motive. The shift from hard data to personal lives often defines the turning point in a homicide investigation. Detectives had the autopsy results, they had the cell site anomalies, and they had confirmation that Robert Lyman's murder was planned, not impulsive. But numbers alone do not tell a story of motive. To understand why a rail worker in Tehachapi had been executed inside his own workplace, investigators turned their attention to the people who knew him best. Robert, 42, had lived in Tehachapi for years with his wife Sabrina. To neighbors, they seemed like a lively couple, known for backyard gatherings, involvement in their local church, and a shared circle of friends within the rail community. Outwardly, the Lyman marriage looked intact. But when investigators began canvassing acquaintances, cracks quickly surfaced. Several friends described Robert and Sabrina as fun but unconventional. That phrasing was vague enough to require follow-up. Interview transcripts revealed more detail. Some friends explained that the couple had experimented with what they called an open arrangement. They attended social gatherings where boundaries were looser than traditional marriages allowed. While not illegal, this dynamic created tension. Those close to the family noted that Robert sometimes embraced the lifestyle more openly than Sabrina. Others claimed the reverse, that Sabrina sought validation outside the marriage. Detectives didn't need to judge morality, but they had to determine whether those dynamics created resentment strong enough to lead to violence. Law enforcement also interviewed Robert's co-workers. Several recalled him mentioning that his marriage was complicated. One colleague remembered Robert joking that life at home was never boring. That comment, harmless on the surface, gained weight once detectives placed it alongside the digital anomalies. If Robert's phone showed deleted conversations and burner activity, and his social life blurred lines between intimacy and secrecy, then the risk of hidden conflicts was high. Sabrina herself was questioned early. She presented as cooperative, grieving, and shocked. She told detectives she had been home on the day of the shooting and had no knowledge of who would want to harm her husband. Her initial statements were consistent, but investigators flagged one detail. When asked about Robert's phone habits, she downplayed his usage, saying he hardly texted. That didn't align with recovered records showing extensive activity. Detectives logged the discrepancy as preliminary, not proof of dishonesty, but it tightened their focus. Beyond marriage, financial pressure was considered. Detectives examined whether Robert's death might have carried a financial benefit. Life insurance policies were confirmed. Robert had coverage through his employer. The payout would be substantial, but not unusual for a man in his position. Friends didn't describe him as wealthy, but as comfortable. The couple had a home, vehicles, and stable employment. Financial stress alone didn't appear to explain the murder. Attention then shifted to Robert's social circle. Interviews with church members, neighbors, and close friends painted Sabrina as charismatic, often the center of attention. Robert, by contrast, was described as steady and dependable. Some witnesses said they admired the couple's bond. Others hinted that beneath the surface, loyalty was questioned. One woman who had known Sabrina socially told investigators she believed Sabrina enjoyed being admired more than being tied down. That subjective comment mattered less as fact than as context. It suggested the marriage carried reputational risks in a small community where gossip spread quickly. Detectives also revisited the burner phone. Cross-referencing numbers dialed from that device against Robert and Sabrina's social contacts revealed a troubling overlap. A number belonging to a young firefighter outside Tehachapi appeared more than once. Investigators pulled his records, learning he had maintained contact with Sabrina. At this stage, it was simply correlation, but in criminal work, correlation often becomes direction. One line from an investigator's notes captured the moment. Patterns point not to random enmity, but to intimacy leveraged against the victim. It was a professional way of saying what the evidence was already hinting. Robert's personal relationships, particularly his marriage, could hold the key to motive. Community response added another layer. In towns like Tehachapi, murders aren't just crimes, they destabilize trust. Neighbors wanted answers. Rumors circulated quickly, some focusing on workplace disputes, others whispering about infidelity. Detectives had to separate noise from substance. Their strategy was straightforward: corroborate gossip with data or discard it. As forensic leads aligned with testimony, investigators faced a central question. Was Robert's murder orchestrated by someone inside his marriage, or was the killer a third party exploiting that turmoil? That uncertainty drove the case forward. The victimology profile was clear. Robert was a loyal worker, socially outgoing, and not known for enemies in his professional life. The instability appeared at home. For homicide investigators, that profile shifted focus from workplace violence to domestic conspiracy. The next procedural step was critical. With suspicions mounting, law enforcement had to determine whether Sabrina's alibi held and whether her connections to outside individuals crossed from lifestyle choice into criminal conspiracy. When homicide investigators reach the point where suspicion sharpens into a workable theory, the language inside the task force room changes. The Robert Lyman case had already moved beyond possible motives and preliminary discrepancies. By the late fall of 2014, detectives in Kern County were actively shaping a charging theory. That meant taking fragments of digital records, interviews, and surveillance gaps and aligning them into a sequence a prosecutor could present in court. The process began with what investigators called the anchor facts. These were non-negotiable. Robert had been shot inside the rail yard shop. There was no sign of forced entry. His routine was known to only a small circle. His cell phone records were irregular in the days leading up to the killing. Each of these details had been separately confirmed. What detectives needed was to connect those facts to human actors. Forensic analysts revisited the burner phone that surfaced earlier. Using toll analysis, they mapped out the frequency of calls and texts. Patterns emerged. One number spiked in activity during work hours but went silent during evenings when Robert would be at home. Another striking feature: several conversations originated from zones near a fire station in Riverside County. This finding drew attention to a firefighter already identified in Sabrina's social orbit. At this stage, the detail was logged as a working lead, not yet hard evidence. Prosecutors are rarely satisfied with coincidence. To move from suspicion to chargeable case, investigators needed corroboration. That came from interviews. Friends who had initially been hesitant began opening up. One individual, when pressed, disclosed that Sabrina had expressed frustration with her marriage, framing Robert as controlling. Another admitted that Sabrina had described a future without her husband. While none of these statements proved conspiracy, they layered context around the burner phone anomaly. Detectives also combed through financial records again. Although Robert's insurance policy wasn't extraordinary, it still represented a substantial payout. Moreover, a closer look revealed recent updates to beneficiary designations. Sabrina stood to gain directly. The timing, less than a year before the murder, was flagged. Insurance changes are not rare, but in homicide cases they are weighted carefully. At this point, the prosecutorial team pushed investigators toward timeline reconstruction. It wasn't enough to suggest discontent in a marriage. They had to establish opportunity. Analysts charted Robert's movements on the day of his death alongside Sabrina's. Her account, that she remained home, was technically plausible, but cell site data told a more complex story. While her personal phone never pinged near the crime scene, the burner phone activity created shadows. It suggested coordination rather than presence. One entry in the lead detective's notes highlighted the shift. Victim not targeted at random. Attack required knowledge of schedule, access to facility, and certainty of his location. All 3 points converged toward intimate connection. By late 2014, the working theory was formalized. Investigators believed Robert's murder was not the result of workplace conflict, but the outcome of a conspiracy. Sabrina Lyman, his wife, had motive: personal freedom, potential financial gain, and the promise of a new relationship. The suspected shooter, Jonathan Hearn, a firefighter linked to her, had the means and the opportunity, but theory alone couldn't sustain an indictment. The district attorney's office emphasized the need for direct evidence tying the suspects to planning. That directive sent investigators back into the digital domain. They recovered partial text fragments from Sabrina's primary phone, messages referencing new beginnings and better life. While not explicit, prosecutors viewed them as circumstantial support. A later forensic extraction pulled deleted data that aligned suspiciously with the days around Robert's death. Community pressure continued. Residents of Tehachapi wanted closure. The rail yard where Robert died had returned to normal operations, but co-workers still spoke about the shooting with unease. A crime committed in such a calculated way suggested betrayal, not randomness. The turning point came when investigators secured a search warrant for electronic devices belonging to Hearn. His records showed encrypted apps, partially deleted conversations, and travel logs consistent with proximity to Tehachapi. Though not all data was recoverable, the pattern grew clear. He was not merely a casual acquaintance. Law enforcement strategy now turned to leverage. By presenting evidence incrementally during interrogations, they sought to pressure admissions. Sabrina remained consistent, denying involvement. Hearn, when confronted, invoked counsel. For investigators, silence from suspects often strengthens the circumstantial web. Prosecutors prepared the charging documents in early 2015. The case would not rely on a single piece of evidence, but on the accumulation of small but mutually reinforcing facts. Robert's death inside a secure location, burner phone records tied to Sabrina's circle, financial incentives, testimony about marital strain, digital remnants linking her to Hearn. Together they formed a coherent narrative of conspiracy. At this stage, detectives and prosecutors faced a choice: charge quickly and risk a weak case or continue to build. They opted for patience. Surveillance of Sabrina and Hearn continued, gathering further documentation of their relationship. That material would later prove pivotal in court. The human side of this stage should not be overlooked. Robert's family sat in limbo, awaiting justice. Friends who had attended his funeral wanted to believe answers were coming, but weeks stretched into months. For them, the silence of law enforcement was frustrating. Yet investigators knew that rushing could undermine the entire case. One assistant district attorney summarized it succinctly. Conspiracy cases aren't built in days. They're layered brick by brick. Each inconsistency, each deleted file, each conversation matters. By mid-2015, the state was ready. Kern County prepared to present its charging theory formally, alleging that Robert Lehman's murder was not just a crime of passion, but a calculated act of conspiracy involving his wife and her lover. Courtrooms are not places of sudden revelations. They are places where weeks, months, sometimes years of painstaking investigation are distilled into exhibits, testimony, and cross-examination. For Robert Lehman's murder, the trial became the final test of whether a pattern of quiet betrayals could be translated into proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors began by outlining their theory. This was not a random act of workplace violence. It was, they argued, a premeditated conspiracy. The jurors heard from detectives who reconstructed the timeline, security footage, cell site records, and testimony from co-workers who had seen Robert only minutes before he was shot. The prosecution's voice was steady. The crime scene had never shown evidence of a forced entry, nor signs of a robbery gone wrong. What it did show, they argued, was precision. In the first week of testimony, forensic specialists walked the jury through ballistics. The weapon recovered did not appear by chance. It was matched by tool marks and firing pin impressions to the bullets extracted during autopsy. Experts used language stripped of speculation. They talked about rifling patterns, cartridge casings, and probability ranges. For jurors unfamiliar with forensic jargon, charts and side-by-side comparisons made the point clear. The same gun had fired those rounds. The medical examiner followed. While the autopsy report had already circulated in pretrial hearings, hearing it in open court was different. Jurors were presented with the systematic findings: trajectory, distance, and the absence of defensive wounds. The cause of death was gunshot trauma, the manner, homicide. It was clinical, but in a courtroom, clinical words carry their own weight. When investigators described Robert as having no chance to defend himself, the narrative of betrayal deepened. Alongside physical evidence, prosecutors introduced testimony from digital analysts. Cell phone records placed one of the suspects in areas that contradicted his public statements. Text exchanges, carefully retrieved and authenticated, were read aloud. What might have once seemed like casual messages now sounded incriminating when set against the backdrop of a murder investigation. Jurors leaned forward, noting phrases that spoke of secrecy, coordination, and resentment. The defense countered, urging jurors not to leap from circumstantial connections to certainty. They argued that digital trails could be misinterpreted, that messages could be taken out of context, and that proximity did not equal culpability. They reminded the court that Robert's workplace could have been accessed by others, that the prosecution had to prove not just suspicion, but deliberate participation in a crime. As the weeks unfolded, personal lives became evidence. Friends testified about the Lyman marriage, about the strains and stories that circulated even before Robert's death. Some accounts suggested a family that projected normalcy, but carried fractures beneath the surface. The defense objected repeatedly, arguing that moral judgment about private lives should not substitute for proof of murder. The court sustained some objections, overruled others, but the image of a relationship under tension remained with the jury. Midway through the trial, the prosecution introduced a chain of custody witness. Every piece of evidence, from call logs to firearms, had to be accounted for. Detectives described how items were sealed, tagged, and transported to labs. These are not the details that make headlines, but they are the details that sustain a conviction. Jurors saw that the case did not rest on a single revelation, but on a sequence of corroborated steps. The defense took its turn with cross-examination. They pressed forensic analysts about margins of error. They highlighted gaps in surveillance coverage, questioning whether moments off camera could alter the narrative. Their aim was not to disprove every point, but to plant doubt, to remind jurors that in criminal law, doubt was enough. Closing arguments brought the case into sharp focus. Prosecutors framed the story as one of calculation, an intimate betrayal cloaked in routine. They said Robert had been targeted not by chance, but by someone who should have been closest to him. The defense, by contrast, appealed to the jurors' sense of caution, that passion, grief, and community pressure should not rush them toward a verdict unsupported by irrefutable proof. The deliberations lasted several days. Inside the jury room, 12 citizens reviewed testimony, re-examined text transcripts, and replayed parts of the ballistics presentation. The question was not whether Robert Lyman had been murdered. Everyone agreed on that. But whether the defendant's actions met the threshold of premeditated conspiracy. When the verdict was read, the courtroom was silent. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty on related charges. For the defense, it was a devastating outcome. For prosecutors, it was the confirmation of years of work. For Robert's friends, it was the beginning of closure, though not the restoration of what had been lost. Trials do not heal. They do not erase what happened in a rail yard office in Tehachapi. But they create a public record. They draw a line between speculation and adjudicated fact. And in true crime, that distinction matters, not only for history but for communities that must decide how to move forward when trust has been broken from within. As the judge dismissed the jurors, reporters noted the subdued faces on both sides of the aisle. Some trials end with outbursts. This one ended with exhaustion. Yet in the exhaustion was also finality. The legal system had spoken. The reading of a verdict rarely ends a homicide case. For the surviving family, for investigators, and for the courts, there are still consequences to unfold. After jurors declared Sabrina Liman guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy, the courtroom transitioned into the sentencing phase. It was there that the abstract language of charges turned into concrete years of punishment. During sentencing hearings, prosecutors emphasized aggravating factors. They highlighted the calculated nature of the offense, a husband killed not in a moment of spontaneous rage, but in a workplace where he should have been safe. They reminded the judge that Robert's co-workers had lived through the shock of finding him lifeless, that his children would grow up with the knowledge that their father's death had not been random, but the result of deliberate orchestration. Victim impact statements followed. Robert's family members spoke directly to the court. They described birthdays and milestones that he would never see. They recounted the toll that grief had taken on parents and siblings who had to sit through months of testimony. Their voices carried the kind of weight that forensics cannot measure. Judges often note that such statements are not legal evidence, but they are a part of justice because they reveal the human cost behind case files. The defense argued for leniency, citing Sabrina's role as a mother and her lack of prior violent history. They contended that life without parole would not only punish her, but also her children, who had already lost their father. Yet the court weighed these arguments against the irreversible nature of the crime. After deliberation, Sabrina was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for conspiracy and solicitation charges. The message was clear. Calculated betrayal carried the heaviest penalty the system could impose short of capital punishment. And her co-conspirator, Jonathan Hearn, had already accepted a plea agreement. His testimony had been part of the trial record, and his sentence reflected the state's interest in securing cooperation. For many, that deal raised uncomfortable questions about proportional justice. Why should the triggerman receive a reduced sentence while the planner bore the maximum? Prosecutors explained that without his testimony, the case might have faltered. Plea bargaining is not about fairness in the abstract. It is about securing convictions in a system that depends on certainty. Following the sentencing, appeals were filed. Defense attorneys argued procedural errors, claiming that certain text messages had been taken out of context and that jury instructions had unduly emphasized conspiracy law. Appellate courts reviewed the claims, but in the years that followed, the convictions and sentences were upheld. By 2025, the case stood as resolved. Sabrina remained incarcerated, her conviction intact. The community of Tehachapi carried its own scars. For a small city, the murder was not just another crime statistic. It was a rupture in the trust of ordinary life. Friends who had once known the couple described the lasting disorientation of realizing that behind familiar smiles had been a plot leading to homicide. In small towns, crime is not distant. It is a reminder that even the places assumed safe can harbor hidden dangers. From an investigative standpoint, the Lyman case underscored the importance of digital forensics. Call records, text messages, and cell site data built a circumstantial net that supported the prosecution's theory. Without those records, the case might have been reduced to conflicting testimonies and speculation. Analysts and law enforcement training programs now cite the Lyman case when discussing how electronic communication can corroborate timelines. It is not that digital traces tell the entire story, but they provide anchors around which testimony and physical evidence can align. Forensic ballistics also played a pivotal role. Toolmark analysis, often challenged in appellate briefs, was admitted and explained clearly enough for jurors to accept. In true crime, the reliability of forensic disciplines is often contested. The Lyman trial reinforced how courts continue to balance technical expertise with lay comprehension, ensuring that complex findings can be understood without distortion. Beyond the courtrooms and labs, the legacy of the case fell hardest on two children. They grew up not only fatherless but also with a mother incarcerated for his death. Family members stepped in to provide care, but the psychological toll is impossible to quantify. In crime narratives, the focus often rests on the act and the trial, but the collateral damage extends decades beyond the verdict. The Lyman children will carry an identity shaped by both victimization and public scrutiny. When the case entered true crime programming and news specials, the tension of betrayal became its defining feature. Viewers across the United States confronted the same unsettling question. How does a marriage disintegrate to the point of conspiracy to murder? Detectives interviewed after the trial reflected on how domestic disputes can escalate when secrecy and outside influences take hold. They emphasized the warning signs, isolated relationships, clandestine communications, financial strain, that often precede such violent outcomes. These reflections were less about reliving one crime than about preventing future ones. By 2025, the case stands as closed. No new evidence has altered the legal outcome. There are no outstanding fugitives, no missing persons, no unresolved mysteries. What remains is a record. A homicide carried out in 2014, adjudicated in 2017, and finalized in appellate courts thereafter. The cause of death has long been established. The responsibility has long been assigned. What lingers is the story, retold not for shock but for the lessons it leaves behind. For communities that follow true crime, the Lyman case is not merely about one couple in California. It is about the capacity of ordinary lives to conceal extraordinary betrayals and the duty of law enforcement to translate suspicion into admissible proof. It is about jurors who must set aside sympathy and make determinations based on evidence, and about families who must rebuild with a permanent absence at the table. The Kern County courtroom brought closure to a case that had unsettled Tehachapi for years. Sabrina Limon was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy, while her lover Jonathan Hearn received a reduced sentence after testifying against her. Justice was delivered. but it came at the cost of two children losing both parents, one to death, the other to prison. For investigators, the case stood as proof of how digital trails, texts, calls, and online records can piece together a conspiracy. For the community, it was a reminder that betrayal inside a marriage can be more devastating than any outside threat. The crime left no winners. Robert's life was stolen, Sabrina's freedom lost, Jonathan's future destroyed, and a family fractured beyond repair. What endures is the lesson that choices made in secrecy and deception never remain contained. Sabrina Lamont remains in prison for murder, Jonathan Hearn serves his plea sentence, and Robert's death continues to mark one of California's most haunting domestic crime cases. As I close this story, I can't help but reflect on how quickly trust can be broken and how devastating the consequences can be. Betrayal doesn't just take lives, it shatters families, ripples through communities, and leaves scars that last forever. My takeaway is simple. Choices rooted in lies will always surface, no matter how carefully hidden. What do you think? Can justice ever truly heal the wounds left by such a crime? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next case we uncover together.